good afternoon, everyone. I know this is always the part of the afternoon after you have some food in your belly and maybe one or two of you decide to get a glass of white wine from the open bar to come over for the session and make it a little more spicy.
Just don't drive. Just don't drive.
But do not drive. Not only was I the former head of the Auto Safety of the United States, I was also the former chairman of the MAD board. So, if you're driving, make sure you have it designated. With that being said, we've had a really fantastic day of exchange amongst the expert panels today. We really thought this was an opportunity for all of us collectively. Yeah, come on. Madam Administrator, please come on up and join us. To really have an opportunity from a collection of some of our experts to talk about some of the takeaways that they've had at this point of the day, but then to open it up to the crowd and really have a really good exchange. And perhaps after that, we may sort of think about whatever the major takeaways were from what we've all collectively learned as a foundation. So really want to appreciate the opportunity and thank you for Team Velodyne. I will take it as a point of personal privilege. I'm a born and raised Atlantan and an Atlanta Falcons fan of over 50 years of suffrage. And I never thought I would be in a place where, Atlanta used to be in the same division as the 49ers for a number of decades, through the 70s, all the way through the 80s. And I never thought I'd be in the place where, the 49ers played. You have a big picture of Joe Montana on the side of the building. I'm shocked that it didn't turn to dust yet. So, but I will say it's a beautiful facility, and we've really had a great day. So with that, I really want to sort of start with maybe some thoughts. Since Christopher, you sort of kicked us off today, do you have any sort of summarizing thoughts or anything before we begin the question and answer session?
Well, it's mostly to thank Velodyne for this idea of bringing everybody together this way, because almost everybody spoke about collaboration, and this is an example of how to get that started, is to bring everybody together to make them realize that the way to really move this needle is to have everybody working together so that they, as someone said, they raise the boat for everyone. I'm not here thinking about what is best for me. I'm here thinking about what's the best for the system, and then we all benefit from whatever is best for the system. So I'm so impressed with Marta for gathering everybody to bring them here together, and I'm going to think this is maybe a first time we've had a group like this assembled to be able to have them see the potential benefits of working together so that everybody wins. Even though they're competitors, everybody has a chance to win. So I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to be part of this.
Oh, thank you. I will say this is probably, in terms of the set of panels, I've seen a number of, frankly, industry leaders and frankly, and actually mostly former Apex safety leaders, with Ceto still being one. He still has a shield for us all. This really has been a fantastic day. Well, Faye, can I turn to you for the next, for what are your turn? Any summary thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think it's been an incredible conference this morning. A conversation around how do we get there, right? So this is what we need to do. The dialogue needs to start now. And I say that it's everyone's responsibility to be part of the dialogue, part of the solution, and really working together, collaborating to ensure that we can get this technology out there and really start saving lives.
Thank you so much, Faye. I guess we'll turn to Anand, since you...
Can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the trenches, right? I'm competing.
Yep.
I'm in a company that's competing for business in this space. And I'll be honest, even though this is the reason we did it, I was really pleasantly surprised by all the people who are working in this space, really having the right intentions, right? People do want to be able to actually get together and solve some of these problems. I was a cynic, I must admit, when I came in thinking, really, are people going to want to do this? But I think people do want to do it, and I think we just have to provide a space and a forum, and then actually have a driving force to keep driving that collaboration forward. So I think that was my big takeaway, is that, yeah, actually people want to do this. So I walk away an optimist.
Wow, we have a convert. Ann, can I ask for you for your thoughts, please?
Oh, delightfully so. Thank you, David. I would say, again, kudos to Velodyne Lidar for raising the bar. From the public sector view, we recognize that a regulatory approach may not be the right approach. It's slow, it's delayed. We will be hard-pressed to be up to the level of innovation that industry can achieve in getting to our safety gains. But does this summit set a model and an expectation, or can it, for other competitors, so that we can say, okay, Vehicle sales have competed on safety for many years. That's the STAR system, that's the consumer report system. But let's take this window of opportunity with autonomous vehicle development and say we're not going to compete on safety. We are going to do a safety sharing. We're going to set standards voluntarily and from a manufacturer's view. And I feel like you guys have started that today. From a manufacturer's view, these are what we think are voluntarily the minimum standards that anyone that's going to operate, test, and deploy in this space needs to meet. So that consumers can at least say, oh, all right, well, if industry is saying that's the minimum, and government isn't saying it's not the minimum, let me at least have that level of familiarity and be grateful that there's that level of openness so that I know what not to buy or what service not to pursue if I'm trying to get into an autonomous vehicle purchase or an autonomous vehicle ride share, because industry set a different standard than this particular company is offering, because it's trying to compete and bring everybody down to the bottom rung. So anyway, I would say that, again, this kind of a conversation is really inspiring. And I will tell you, those young engineers, whoever is supporting them between Velodyne Lidar and SAE, that's quite a group. If we can get those two young engineers to offer that collaboration model to other groups. There you are. Right up front. You already look so mature. You have aged just in half a day with all of us older folk, but thank you. But I think you set the model. You demonstrate that collaborative approach for a higher cause with a great business and safety, public good outcome.
And thank you so much. Ray, can I turn to you?
Well, certainly one of the things we have to overcome is communication with the people who need to use these technologies. Everybody talks about safety and cars and things like that, but it's a much bigger horizon that we're looking at. We've taken our organization and we started really working hard to create those collaborations by getting involved with different associations, building an umbrella association, reaching out to all of our customers in the state DOTs to try to help them become more aware of what's coming. A lot of people in the dark, they have misconceptions and they're making wild statements of, I'll never do this. And I saw a report on CBS Morning News the other day where they interviewed the Google team and they wanted to interview the people that were going to start using the Google taxi. And what they found is like 70% of the people who you just go up to will say, I don't want to do that. But then they ride it and they go, oh, I get it. Well, that's the responsibility of this group. If we want technology, if we want what we're working on to be accepted, we have to come up with a really good way to communicate that and make it non-threatening. I think this event was really nice today because I heard a lot of really good thought leaders talking about what they're working on, and I can now start weaving that into the fabric of what I have to do to help educate society on it.
Ray, thank you so much. Last and certainly not least, truly the man that where the rubber hits the road, Ceto. Any last thoughts?
You didn't just get a ticket or anything, right?
I'm a former NHTSA administrator, man. I don't speed.
He wants us to get a jail card or something.
Yeah, real nice
It's only
of you.
monopoly. I've heard a lot of professionals this afternoon and now, and it's, to me, the recurring theme that I've heard is the necessity for this technology to save lives and reduce collisions. And that means a whole lot to me when I'm I don't consider myself to be in the law enforcement business, but in the people business. So when I see the things that I've seen over 24 years, to see a group of professionals devoted to, committed to reducing collisions and saving lives, to me that's incredibly important. Whether it's through industry standards or the government standards, I know there's a conversation about that. Obviously there has to be some standards there for first responders and for the public, but super, super proud to be a part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to do sort of a combination here because I'm getting some cards of folks that have had some questions. But also, since the room is small enough, if we have, feel free to stand up and ask for recognition. We'll take your question that way as well. I'm going to sort of combine a couple of it because they basically cover the same thing. This is regarding sort of a multi-party collaboration process and safety assurance. Really, how do we sort of get all of these interworking groups of people, clearly the component manufacturers, the OEMs, the safety regulators, the folks that are responsible for policing the roads. Really, it's an entire ecosystem. The motor vehicle administrators is a huge ecosystem of people that have worked together for over a century to sort of build a framework of what we see as American driving today. And that changes in a handful of years and probably in smaller aspects of, like I said, the Waymo taxi, et cetera. But as it goes broad over the years, how do we, making sure that we can get those groups to make sure they work together collaboratively, and then the B is, how can these groups work together to pick the right level of safety? We got one of these questions earlier on the panel, like how safe is safe? And the combination of all these groups, whether it's the federal government, the states, the police departments, the administrators, how can these groups all come together to come to a consensus on how safe is safe? And I'll throw it open to anyone to start the discussion.
Well, I can start with the, the aviation experience, because I have to tell you, getting people with varying interests and sometimes competing interests to collaborate is not trivial. So for starters, there's a little bit of human nature in this. The human nature is, I'm okay, you're not. So I got my act together. Why don't you guys go get your act together, then come back and talk to me, and then we can have a conversation. But I've got my act together, so don't include me yet. So this, the reason I say it's human nature, because how many times have we heard, hey, I don't need to go to the marriage counselor. You're the one who's got the problem. You go to the marriage counselor.
They haven't heard that yet.
Right. So that's an example of how it's not easy to get people to collaborate. In addition to the fact, as I say, they have differing interests and sometimes competing interests. So in aviation, two of the collaborators are labor and management. They're always after each other. Two of the collaborators are the manufacturers and the operators. If there's a crash, the manufacturer and the operator are going to be co-defendants in court. So and we're asking them to come and play in the sandbox together. So it's not easy. And the way that what it takes is to get people to in their I guess, what should I call it, in their inherent self-interest, in their informed self-interest, to realize what's in it for them to work together. Everybody has to say, there's something in this for me to work in this collaboration. So,
Yeah.
so that inherent self-interest is really, has to be the driver that you need to appeal to get people to want to work in this environment, this collaborative environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key term for me is informed self-interest, right? I mean, and I think that's why I turned to being an optimist today, because I think there's enough people who, especially people who are seriously working on this problem, recognize how hard this problem is to solve, whether it's full autonomy or even really good really safe advanced safety. And there's so many cases in the world, and the world is so variable. There's so many things that can go wrong. And I would say it's almost impossible for one collection of human beings to conceive of every possible thing that could go wrong. And people who are working in this space, I am heartened to say, seem to recognize that. And so if you recognize that, then it's in your informed self-interest as a profit-making entity to make sure that you learn as much as you can about the stuff that you really don't know. And so I would say, in the corporate world, in the corporate ecosystem who are working on this, I think really appealing to that informed self-interest and getting the people who in those companies who work on the technology to actually admit that there are flaws in the technology is a great starting point. And if you're able to do that, then I think you will naturally see people in those companies want to come together.
Well, and just to reinforce the path you were going down, I don't know that anybody can say today what's the minimum standard. I don't think we can say that. But through this iterative testing and ideally the sharing of data that Alex talked about earlier, the continuous learning goes on and you keep getting to a better place. I mean, ideally, if we continue to improve it as we're moving, and that each kind of test going on any public roadways is an opportunity to say, oh, can we get better, or where are the flaws here, and learn from it. But it's got to come with data sharing. And so I have one ask to anybody in this room: if you have the opportunity to be at the table with a governor or a premier or a chief legislator, please counsel them against an individual self-led legislative initiative. Make sure they look around the room and say, who's at the table with us? Make sure always you've got everybody at the table, because if we don't get there, we're really not going to be moving as fast and as far as we can. And each of you has an opportunity to influence that. You may say, well, I've got the in with the governor. Well, you may craft a legislative framework that works for you, but it's not going to help others, and it's probably not going to help the initiative in the long run. So just look around the room and make sure, is there one of everybody in this stakeholder group?
If I may, I'd like to touch on this subject as well, and I want to give us some good news. And that is in 2015, 14 OEMs came together and said, hey, the world is changing. We need to work together to collaborate and to share information. How do we do that? And they looked and found a model called Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, ISAC, public-private partnership that was designed in 1998 based on a presidential policy directive for Homeland Security to really enhance the ability of our nation, because much of the critical infrastructure in the US is either owned or operated by the private sector. So the ideal was that the private sector would sort of self-collaborate, self-organize, come together, work together, and then also work with government. And this gets into the whole regulatory aspect as well as sharing information and data that sometimes the government has a whole lot more than all of us. Okay? And they did come together through maybe some suggestions from NHTSA.
Oh, no, suggestions.
And they did, and thanks to NHTSA. They did come together, they incorporated in 2015 and started the Automotive ISAC. I joined 2 years later in 2016, or 1 year later, 2016, and I can tell you this, that it's not just OEMs anymore, it's the OEMs and it's the whole supply chain. And those are the ones that are eligible, anyone working in the connected vehicle autonomous space. Beyond that, we also have what we call our strategic partner program, which says, maybe you're not actually one of those two types of folks or folks that are working on the connected vehicle, but you're in the ecosystem. We want you at the table. So NHTSA is at the table as a strategic partner. So is academia. So is the trade associations that do the policy and the legislation. So we work together. We come together as a community. It's an unnatural act to share across competitors. That's why the ISAC was formed. In a way, it's a platform that really, we are the information broker. We anonymize data. We make sure that they feel comfortable in sharing. There's lots of lawyers that were involved in developing the right member sharing agreements, and they actually are sharing. And they're working on these best practices also, which really helps the industry move a little faster and a little quicker.
I was hoping you were going to jump in, Faye. You read my mind. Also, before we transition, actually, I want to sort of answer one question about what is a proper level of safety and how safety works for light-duty and, frankly, heavy-duty vehicles in the space. It's basically a notion called the unreasonable risk to safety. So while we had an original set of motor vehicle safety standards in 1966, which included seat belts as one of the very first ones, right? We don't have safety standards to cover every vehicle technology that actually improves safety. It is this general notion of what proves to be an unreasonable risk, and that's evaluated over what's available at the time and is best industry practice. And that's what raises safety over the fleet over the years. So when you see these demonstrations, I know that the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they have a display in their main building where they had a 1950 Chevrolet hit like a year 2002 Chevrolet and a corner hit. And the 1950 Chevrolet, it might have been a Bel Air, it is like 3 times bigger than the Malibu that it hit. The Malibu that hit was almost, safety cage was intact. If there was human beings in the vehicle, they probably would have walked away from that crash. The 1950-something Bel Air was completely demolished because you have the evolution of safety over time. And I think the one thing, and I think it might have been Ann and Anand sort of picked up on this point, you don't want to pick a static point in time. It's like, this is what safety should be. Because you want the ability, to be able to get technology integrated into the fleet as quickly as we can, and then you want the ability to hold accountability for improvements over time. So you don't keep safety. You're always okay if you do these 3 things. You want to have a higher standard for everybody. So I think that's the other thing we need to think about in this sort of notion of how safe is safe. It's definitely an evolutionary process. To segue back to, does anybody else have a
I just want
response
to say
to?
one.
Yeah, but please go ahead, Ceto.
The law enforcement interaction plan that we kind of discussed about earlier, that's directly in line with that. How else are we going to know what's occurring out there? When the manufacturer applies for a permit with the DMV, that manufacturer is required to provide the CHP with the law enforcement interaction plan. And if for some reason that vehicle is involved in a collision, a report's supposed to be generated and provided to the DMV. So how else are we going to know where to improve on unless it's reported on? So excellent point.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else before I move to the next question?
I just wanted to add that there are two extremes that you can pretty certainly say you don't want to start with. One is perfection, because that ain't going to happen. So forget about that extreme. The other one is just slightly better than the way it is. I don't think that's a very wise standard either. It needs to be substantially better and evolve with time, as David says, as the technologies and the processes develop, and have it evolve with time. But perfection ain't it, and just a little better than the way it is now ain't it either. So we know that those two extremes are not where we want to be.
Thank you all. I actually have a rather provocative question, which sort of extends off of this notion. Volvo promotes itself as one of the safest cars. They invest in the technology and they market it. Why can't companies compete on safety? And I think this is also certainly where we're talking about intellectual property, your testing process, confidential business information. You know, where if you solve a problem or an edge case and maybe another manufacturer hasn't made those investments and they don't have that same solution, why shouldn't we theoretically allow the winner take the spoils? They've made the investment in safety. Why shouldn't they get rewarded for it? And maybe we should just let them openly compete on safety. Thoughts on that rather broad question, but I'd love to hear it.
I'll pick on the specific example that you used of edge cases.
Sure.
And I know we have talked about this before, and I think that's fine. I mean, I think every company is going to have a different way to solve for a particular edge case, and some companies, as it's the case today, have not solved for many edge cases, and there are one or two who have. Mm-hmm. But I think the acknowledgement that that edge case is important is a collective piece of knowledge that they can all share. So I think especially because in the context of autonomy, this is a technology that is new that we are introducing into society, you know, and it has not, let us be frank, gained acceptance yet. Mm-hmm. I think it's again in every company's informed self-interest to do so. So I would say, yes, they can still compete on the implementation, mm-hmm. but the fact that there are a set of edge cases that are considered to be critical across the industry for establishing the autonomy safety case, I think that information can be shared in an anonymous fashion, like through an ISAC or something.
I'm going to follow up in a little bit of a devil's advocate question. So what you're saying is, as long as the company that finds the edge case discloses the existence of the edge case, but they can keep their particular solution to themselves, even though maybe you have other operating fleets, like say you have other self-driving taxis that are out there that are exposed to that possibility of the edge case, they may not have a solution that you do have, and you think that's okay?
I think that's okay.
Any differences of opinion?
Yeah, I'll pipe up.
Okay.
So I'll go back to Alex to earlier. Mm-hmm. We want to have zero accidents, right? So I came from aviation, no accidents from 2009 to just recently with the Southwest incident. We need to get there in automotive. And we have to say we do not compete on safety and security. I used to stand up as the aviation ISAC director, and I said, we do not compete on safety and security. We're going to collaborate on safety and security because it is our industry. And I'll give you one last point, which is a little dramatic, but 9/11 happened. Those were Boeing aircraft that went down that day. And Boeing was sued 12 years in legal entanglement. But Airbus got hurt just as badly as Boeing, as did United, as did Lufthansa, as did Delta, et cetera. So the whole industry can go down if we start competing on it. Now, I think to the point that you're making, diversity is really important, and they should be able to be diverse in how maybe they implement things. Yeah. But there has to be a baseline of safety and security that we all agree to and move towards.
Yeah, and I think that's with the edge cases, it's a classic. So there will be some edge cases which collectively the people sitting, you know, at the table will say, okay, this is not really ever going to happen. So let's not worry about it. But that has to be, again, there has to be a forum or some sort of collective mechanism for making that decision, with maybe some arm twisting from the government agencies in some cases, but that needs to be there. But there will be some edge cases where you may look at it and say, okay, this is important enough where now we have to stop and reconsider, and let's actually look at it. And I do believe it's in the best interest of the entire industry to do that because, again, I think a rising tide does float all boats in this case.
Thank you. Ann?
Yeah, but you saw me kind of shoving my way in there.
No,
So I'm gonna-
you were seeking recognition, you have recognition.
So here's the challenge, and this is why AV creates a different environment than our traditional OEM competitive environment. We're talking about a crash-free world. What are you competing on in safety if you're saying, I'm making a crash-free car, you're making a crash-free car, you're making a crash-free truck? Why wouldn't we share that crash-free outcome? Maybe we're competing on comforts and mobility. Maybe we're competing on comforts of view or visibility or appearance. But why? Where's the competition there? We're driving towards the same outcome. I don't know that the world of vehicle development and I think we're in a different phase now with the visibility of a very different outcome than we've had for, since cars came out.
I spend a lot of time in infrastructure, and so one of the things I'm working with state DOTs all the time is the road itself. And it's amazing, we put down these hard surfaces and we put cars on them, but we also create all kinds of new ways for these cars not to be able to successfully travel down these roads. And so we take our data, our 3D data, and we analyze it, we look at it. We look where water starts to pool, or if you're coming into a curve, you have the crown in the road, as you hit the curve, it starts tipping, and you create a pocket where water is going to sit just before the car hits the curve. So we need to look at that piece, and if we take and make cars autonomous, we can tell cars how to take care of that. Where the human factor is, we don't know what's coming, we don't know how to deal with it, and we'll make a mistake, and people get hurt from that.
I'll say this, and there's actually just really great thoughts here. Ultimately, we're dealing with a different ecosystem from FAA to traditionally what has been, the automotive manufacturing ecosystem, where for a century, effectively, they have been competing on safety. They have been allowed to make different investments, and ultimately, that unreasonable risk of safety consideration moved the line. Where do you put your gas tank? In the very back of your SUV, or do you put it mid-vehicle so it's protected, it's better protected from crash forces? Or when you're thinking about, sharp bumpers. In the 50s, you had those big, crazy, fancy bumpers, and, that have a bad tendency to impale people, and those went away, too. I mean, extreme cases, but this industry has improved by having open competition. But I think what you all are saying here is that we're talking about a new shared ecosystem where you have vehicles that drive themselves as a way different model than what we have been accustomed to thinking. I think all of you made variations on a theme of how we can maybe break down those barriers. I mean, Mark Rosekind isn't here, who is a NHTSA administrator that followed me. But one of the issues that he talked about all the time is we can't compete on safety, that same FAA model. And how do we sort of get the industry to get comfortable with that? And I think that'll be a great challenge for everybody and how we can make it more comfortable.
David.
Yes, please.
Similarly, in law enforcement, we share information across the board. It's very common for law enforcement agents to reach out to another agency. For instance, it's just body-worn cameras, right?
Yeah.
What their technology is, what are the results they've been getting back on their studies. We're there to help each other because we all have a common purpose, which is really to provide that service to the public. So it's very similar on this side, and we do share it, we encourage it, and I've never heard of an occurrence where law enforcement wouldn't share with another agency.
No, it's an excellent point.
So David, I'd like to follow on your
Please, Chris.
point. I think we're in a situation where there's change coming because historically the NCAP program was a competition on safety. I've got more stars than you do, so people are going to buy my car because it's got more
Exactly right.
stars. I'm not sure that in aviation the reason they don't compete is because anybody's crash is everybody's crash. So that means I'm not only going to try to stop my crashes, I'm going to try to stop you guys from crashing too, because the public doesn't say that's airline X, the public says that's flying and I'm flying, and that scares me. I think that dynamic is what we're starting to see when we see the Tesla crash in.
Even though it's not really an
Wilson?
automated vehicle, but
Right.
yes. But
People just say
it's
that's an automated
imputed.
vehicle. They
Right.
don't say necessarily that's a Tesla. They say that's an automated vehicle. When we see Uber and Tempe.
Yeah.
So when we see
That's-
those kinds of, I think the public's perception of those events is this is an automated car, not this is an Uber or this is a Tesla. And I think that may change the dynamic significantly from where they used to be, which was let's compete vigorously on safety and we got more stars, to let's work together to raise the water together.
Excellent point. Want to change it a bit, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. And the question is, in a scenario where it isn't feasible to create a truly, fully independent automated vehicle, what smart information improvements may be needed to be made on city streets in order to facilitate that automation? Basically, do we need better and smarter infrastructure to reach the dream of level 4 or level 5 fully automated vehicles? And what suggestions would you have on how we get there?
Well, I'm in mapping, so we believe the base map is the core to that. So if you create the virtual rail, similar to trains, if you put that virtual rail out there and have everybody drive on that virtual rail, you'll be okay, because I come from a climate where it snows. I can't see the pavement stripes when it snows, so I need to know where I am. So we do self-localization and use that data to create that path. We use the Velodyne sensors because of the accuracy. I mean, we really are trying to find, plus or minus a couple of inches where the edge of the road is and try to get that information, create those vectors off of that. So infrastructure doesn't necessarily have to get smart. What we need to do is think about our infrastructure differently and create intelligence about the infrastructure. And the other part of that is the autonomous vehicle shouldn't have to figure everything out. It should have a base map that it looks at, and if there's change, it looks for change detection. And that makes it a much simpler, lower CPU cycle event if you have something that changes in it.
Anyone else on infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I think the base map is obviously a great point. I mean, I think that's table stakes, I think, to really make these things safer. A couple of other ones which come to my mind. One is, I think there will always be scenarios that will require some sort of remote override of the autonomous vehicle. There'll be scenarios where the autonomous vehicle will be asked to do unnatural things like drive in the opposite direction on a one-way just because the freeway is blocked, as an example. So you will need, I believe you will need sort of control infrastructure to allow a remote operator to take control of an autonomous vehicle. So that means both an end sort of wireless control infrastructure, whether it's 5G or something like that, and in addition to that, obviously, infrastructure within the vehicle to allow for that to happen, and then also maybe hooks that law enforcement has access to in scenarios where law enforcement has to take control of a vehicle in some situation where an autonomous vehicle is just stopped in the middle of the freeway and there's no other choices, right? So there's scenarios where I think you need vehicle to infrastructure communication to be able to do that. And then the other more, I would say, slightly provocative thing I would say is, I think I know your question was sort of premised on, if we don't have the perfect autonomous vehicle, right, and we will definitely not start there, I think the other thing that would actually be worth thinking about is autonomous zones or autonomous lanes. Because I think the biggest variable is going to be how the human driver in a different vehicle interacts with an autonomous vehicle.
Well, I'll give you a classic example in the news today. There was an article about why is it that people keep rear-ending the Waymo taxi in Chandler, Arizona?
Right.
Like people don't presume, perfect driving. And when you get perfect driving ahead of you, you end up with probably more rear-end crashes. I think it's a classic example of how do you sort of deal with that interaction and exchange.
Right. So I think having autonomous zones or autonomous lanes would be a great way to prove out the technology to the common public and get the miles on the road while avoiding, in some cases, those sorts of interactions and those sorts of human-machine interactions, which are extremely complicated.
The other part of this, too, is how we connect the vehicle. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we find many of the people we're working with are working on the dynamic map, where the vehicles themselves, what I do as a business, the cars are going to be able to do. So as that comes online, how do we get that information back to the entire fleet of vehicles that are in a region so they can talk to each other? And I was at the AV Symposium here in San Francisco this summer. And I was there to look at a sensor discussion, and the discussion before was on the connected vehicle. And it was somebody from Qualcomm and somebody from Toyota. And I went in thinking, well, 5G, it's got so much upside. And they let the Qualcomm guy say everything that was great about 5G, and then the Toyota guy got up and he said, yeah, no, we're going DSRC. And I didn't understand how far these guys are willing to go. Toyota guy said that this year, in 2019, we're putting DSRC in all of our cars. And the question came up, is there room for both of them? And the Toyota guy said, no, only one of them is going to be there. And somebody said, well, Toyota, just because you're Toyota, you think you can make that decision for all of us? And the guy paused, he looked at him, and he went, yeah. That's kind of how it goes. There are all kinds of good reasons for both technologies, but eventually we need to have all the vehicles connected, because what's happening in one needs to be broadcast to all the other ones. And especially as we get into smart cities, smart intersections. I have 3 projects right now in my group that we're doing that are corridors, where we're going to be connecting to the street lights, we're going to be connecting to the metro systems, and we're going to be trying to figure out ways to allow mobility for all these systems simultaneously. So we'll get a lot of practice over the next few years before true connected autonomous vehicles get on the road. We're going to get a chance to see how all these different systems integrate and work together.
So David, you're going to be very surprised that I'm going to bring an aviation example to bear here. Most of what we've talked about today has been how to make the car safer. The reason aviation is safe is not because they made the airplane safer, it's because the airplanes, A, were made safer, but B, also interact with the environment, and C, also interact with other airplanes. So ultimately, I think the infrastructure and the other vehicles sharing the space are going to have to be part of this equation in order for us to get the kind of premier safety that we're looking at in aviation. So it's not just the vehicle by far, it's the vehicle plus the other vehicles plus the environment, the infrastructure that's going to have to play a big role in this total picture.
This is really hard, right? This is what we call complex system of systems engagement and multiple stakeholders, all with a diverse background. So the only way this works is if we all work together. Clearly, if we have smart cities and we have all this great infrastructure, government's going to play a role, aren't they? So what role do they play, and how do we collaborate with them? What does that look like? And who actually manages this overall system of systems? Very hard, complex question, and I don't think we know the answer yet.
I think it's great. And actually, both of you led me to a perfect segue to this next question, which is basically, to sum it up, how do we deal with allocation of resource for all road users when you have L5? And I'll say, using it as a perfect example, even this past year or two, what you see on city streets is wildly changing. You now have e-scooters and you have e-bikes, in addition to the traditional pedestrian usages of streets, and the fact that there is prime real estate that is being expanded and contracted, and now with the thought of automated vehicles, which could possibly increase automotive usage if people take to it and they would rather take an automated vehicle, or decrease it. You know, I'm actually going to pick on person. Ceto, I'm going to talk to you because you're sort of the one group, law enforcement, has to deal with interaction of all road users, and sometimes you have to sort of make decisions on the fly, which may not necessarily be part of the code to make it work. How do we sort of deal with this evolving situation from a law enforcement perspective, and how do we protect all road users?
It's complex. I'm going to go back real fast to something that my friend here said about having autonomous lanes. I'm not sure, maybe for discussion, would that be sharing with sharing with express lane, HOV lanes? There's so much to be discussed about that, because I do believe, like you just mentioned, that there will be an increase in traffic because perhaps the elderly or the sick will want to use an autonomous vehicle.
Yep.
I have a 91-year-old father, though. He wants to drive desperately, I can tell you that, but he would probably take it up.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So it's just very complex.
It is, and also to, talking about, there's talk about other policy issues. We may be looking at, congestion charging to make sure that since everybody will have a capability to take using individual mobility, we're going to maybe have more users of that technology, because we are now empowering the disability community. We're empowering seniors to be able to actually be able to get to place. But how do we sort of go through this transition of, as people, hopefully self-driving vehicles are wildly popular and people have a huge uptake, then how do we not have this crossover situation where we do have, not even just sort of congestion interactions, but even crash interactions between, other pedestrian systems versus possibly more vehicles on the road?
I say we bring our highway planners and our city planners on this stage to join us in the conversation. Sorry, I interrupted.
That's good.
Go ahead.
I think when you talk about mobility, you need to talk about the whole package and stop talking about cars alone. When we talk about an autonomy, is I want to get from here to the Oakland airport. And I should have the ability to look at all the different solutions, what would be the most cost effective, what would be the most time effective, and then I'll pay accordingly to which one meets my current needs. And that's how we'll get to that end game. It'll have to be based on what is a person's needs and what are they willing to pay to change that course. And, but it's got to include all mobility. We got to get off the thing that we're going to have one car and we're going to jump in it. It's going to take us from here to there. It has to be, I've got all these resources and I can get there, even if I have to walk a half mile to get something to happen or get to someplace.
And I do think it is a crossover problem, right? I do believe in the end state where eventually you will have, more people on the roads with fewer cars on the streets. Because, ultimately, today I own a car and I use it 2 hours of the day or 3 hours of the day, depending upon on traffic. But, I'll be able to lease a car and then be able to do that and have one car be shared by 8 people. So I think that this is a transition. It is a real problem. I don't deny that, but I think it is a transition problem. And then eventually you will get to a place where, as Ray said, you'll just have a suite of solutions depending upon the distance that you want to travel, and maybe transitions will be seamless at that point.
And a variation on that theme that hasn't really been discussed and is kind of collateral to what we're talking about is that the projections are widespread that this transformation is going to include also a transformation from ICE, internal combustion engine, to electric. So now we need a source of funding because we're not having fuel taxes anymore. So that's going to be another piece of this equation that is going to have to be addressed, is how is this all going to be paid for, and because it's not going to be as much from fuel taxes as it was.
My 2 oldest children one lives in New York City and one lives in Chicago, and both of them gave up their cars because they sat down and they did the equation. What is the most effective way for me to be able to have mobility? And if you're going to own a car, you got to park it, you got to buy the gas and everything. And what they found out is both of them were going to save upwards of $700 a month if they got rid of their car. And I admire it because it's been a couple years and both of them are still functioning perfectly in all their everyday needs without having a car. If they have to rent one, that's part of their mobility. They go to the rental station, they pick up a car, and then they actually drive it. But in most cases, they can accomplish 90% of what they want to with mobility solutions.
No, car share and ride share really, especially in urban environments, it really does sort of fill in those gaps when you actually can't, use the train. But it's a great point, right? Actually, well, since we're talking a little policy, I'm going to segue this to an actually policy question from the audience. And put on your king and queen of the world hat, okay? So feel unconstrained. If you could pass any federal bill regarding EV technology, what would you legislate or state bill? Wow. As I said, queen or king.
What was the second part there?
It could federal bill or state bill. So if you, what is the dream piece of legislation that you guys think will need to happen to make EVs happen in a thoughtful and well-implemented way? I know that's kind of a whammy question, but I thought it was kind of fun.
That's so multifaceted.
It is. Well, pick a facet. I'm not letting you off. Pick a facet. You don't have to be all of them.
I've been working with states, and we're trying to help all the states have knowledge on this. And it comes down to is at some point we're going to have to legislate that you have to move to autonomy. And that sucks because we as Americans, all of us in the room have grown up having access to a car. And it's been part of our youth and part of the way we grow up. But we are a different society, and as we're moving forward, we need to seriously think about the fact that we're all going to have to get into this mobility formula. And one of the ways that I heard, this goes back a few years talking to some federal highways people, was if you're driving your car and they decide they've got all these smart city, it's got all these monitors, and they're going to watch how fast you drive your car, and they're going to give you a ticket for every time you go over a mile over the speed limit. And they'll charge you $250 for every time you do that. It won't take you very long to say, I'm not driving anymore. I cannot afford that. I think I saw some camera signs out here in this area, $366 stoplight cameras. And you see something like that, well, if you in one day went through it's not just going through, they catch you going a little bit in. I think what they're going to do, that'll be part of the legislation, is try to create this way to force you to go to autonomy because it'll be too expensive, because as humans, we don't drive like the cars down in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. We all take things for granted. We roll through stop signs. We drive 5, 10, or on the interstate, some people 20, 30 miles over the speed limit. But that's how they'll get us to change over. They're going to tell us how we have to drive or
Wrong
we're
thing
going
to
to pay
say,
for it.
wrong thing to say. 20, 30 over.
Yeah,
Yeah, no.
Wrong thing to
Really,
say.
the rest of
I'm
the
about to
driver
say,
tickets,
you're
suspend,
surrounded by
revoke.
former safety
Suspend,
officials and a
revoke.
current safety official.
Yeah, we got access. We got access. Did you film it? So I'll tell you the magic, I mean, there is no magic bullet. We all know that. There is no silver bullet. There's silver scatter shot. The ideal legislation would be to ban any legislation or veto any legislation that's presumed to answer your question.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say Pennsylvania, each state, just as I said, you know, you're all testing in a living laboratory. Each state regulatory or non-regulatory framework is also a living laboratory. We're sort of seeing what works and what doesn't. Pennsylvania enacted some interesting legislation that allows PennDOT to move forward with policy. PennDOT's got a massive partnership between Carnegie Mellon and state officials and highway officials and
actual other states, they're working with.
and other jurisdictions, that's right, right across that belt, right up through Michigan. And so they've got a built-in iterative approach that allows that responsiveness that policy provides. So first, that magic legislation, it immediately vetoes and self-destructs anything that tries to answer your question with a standard.
I have an idea.
Yes,
So my idea would be, first you have to abolish Department of Transportation and make it Department of Mobility. And the Department of Mobility includes federal, state, and local government, as well as the private sector, which would co-chair it. They would then work on how do we deploy autonomous vehicles.
Man, you took that Queen thing seriously.
And?
I thought it was fantastic. Wow. Well, thank you. Anybody else?
Well, I'm the technologist, so mine is probably the least informed answer of all, but I'll attempt it. I think one of the biggest challenges for companies developing this technology is, at least in the initial phases, is going to be liability. And so finding a mechanism to allow companies to safely develop the technology while dealing with the liability, whether it's an FDIC kind of model or some model like that where there is sharing of insurance or something to deal with liability. So as I said, a completely different take on it, but I think the technology will get there if the liability concerns are removed.
All great ideas, and one thing especially, I'm sorry, Chris, I'll go ahead.
So I've got two issues that I think uniformity is crucial on, and I've heard about one of them today. I haven't heard about the other one. One I've heard about is cybersecurity. So to me, that needs not necessarily legislation, but a strong federal presence, because this is not a U.S. problem, this is a world problem, and that means who's going to deal with Korea and Japan and Germany and all the other car-making countries. It can't be the states, it's going to have to be. So that's one I've already heard about that I think is going to need. The other one I haven't heard squat about today is ethical issues. So I gave an example in a speech to the National Press Club a couple of years ago about my car's driving along fat, dumb, and happy, and then there's an 80,000-pound truck coming at me in my lane, and there's 15 pedestrians on the sidewalk. So now is my car going to take me into the truck to save the pedestrians, or is it going to take out the pedestrian to save me? And to me, that's the kind of ethical issue that's going to be rare, to be sure. It's not going to be encountered much, but somebody has to step up to the plate, and to me, that demands uniformity, and again, it's going to have to work with multiple governments. So to me, there needs to be a uniform federal presence on that one, and I haven't heard squat about that. And most of the ethical conversations I've heard about have been in academia, like Toronto, the University of Toronto. I'm not hearing it from the manufacturers. I'm hearing it in academia. So those are two issues that I think really need uniformity of treatment around the world.
I'll say this because the ethics issue is one that I talk a lot about in a lot of forums. Yeah. Manufacturers make ethical decisions about the design of your vehicle today in terms of who it's most protective of and who it's least protective of. So that's not really a new issue. And I think ultimately it's going to come down to, I agree with you, there's going to have to be some conversation about how and whether, machine interface that makes decisions, are we going to force it down on engineers to make social decisions about who you choose to kill? And I think is one of these decisions where I'm not really quite sure that technologists are going to be positioned to do, or frankly, even government's going to be positioned to do, especially if we're talking about, a zero fatality universe. But with that being said, it's both and all excellent points.
Well, taking Ann's comment into consideration, this doesn't mean Fed's doing it by themselves. This has to be a collaborative effort.
And it's
that
going to, yeah,
involves.
absolutely, it's definitely going to
You
take.
say the Fed's advising themselves? That's a funny line, Chris.
That's hilarious.
Two things there.
Oh, go ahead, Ray.
First of all, if you want to talk ethics, I think the Uber case in Phoenix should become classwork. Everybody should look at that because there are so many levels of ethics involved in that case. And I'm not an expert on it, but I can tell you, knowing the sensor packages, they made some mistakes. But it was so random that somebody would just walk out from the center of that median. That's not a normal thing. So Uber kind of got caught. They were in a gray area on their ethics, and they got caught because some random thing happened, and it was devastating to that individual that happened.
I'll disagree, not because of, I do represent Uber as part of a coalition, so they need to be held fully accountable for the decisions that they made. They had layers of redundancy that all of them failed. And, and ultimately, I don't think that they were making an ethics decision. They had a safety driver that wasn't doing the right decision. They made a scientific decision as to disabling some of the sensors so they can actually figure out their own sensor array. They thought they had the right package of countermeasures, and they were wrong, because at the end of the day, a human being as a single point of failure is going to be a human being as a single point of failure. Because if the lady was paying attention, none of this would have happened. But with that being said, I don't think it's that. I think it's they were comfortable in their assumptions that they had enough countermeasures to deal with any sort of traffic interaction, and they were wrong. And I think that's the learning, and they hired a very smart man to help them work that through, right, Chris?
And the one infrastructure piece of that is the woman was on a sidewalk that led to the street, but there was no crosswalk there. It just a sidewalk that dead ended at the street. So that was an infrastructure issue.
Illustrated why that needs to be a case study.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
There
and
were
on
so
the,
many layers.
only thing I'll add on the ethics thing is, someone said this, I think they're right. Technologists hate to actually deal with this question. So part of the reason why you're not hearing this conversation is because the engineers are trying not to deal with it, right?
Absolutely.
On one hand. And I think on the other hand, I would also say, Chris's point is absolutely right. Somebody needs to deal with it.
Right.
And it's not going to be the engineers.
No, it's
because
not. It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, because I don't think the engineer will be able to wake up in the morning and go to work if he has to deal with that. Because they'll just try to make the best, safest system that they can make. So, but there has to be, this conversation has to be on the table, maybe in the context of the collaboration that we talked about.
No, absolutely.
And say, okay, what are the sort of key ethical scenarios that this machine's going to have to deal with? And this should, again, not be an area that you compete in at all.
Agreed.
Right? This is obviously just every machine should act the same way.
We could talk about this for weeks. So I'm going to transition this. All of these topics we can talk about for weeks, but that's especially, it's a good one. Plus, not only it's a great intellectual exercise in terms of how you sort of deal with social mores. I'm going to switch this back to a little cybersecurity and design. The first question is, to deter intrusion, is the elimination of the onboard diagnostic support?
You didn't deter
You have
intrusion,
intrusion.
Dave.
I got intruded upon. We will include on this one. Does that mean that the OBD port is on its way out? And how do we think about hardening the vehicle in terms of cyber intrusions? And I'll leave it to probably to the biggest experts we could possibly have on this issue.
Well, the new safety thing is going to be cyber, because really the vehicle is going to be in communications and tapped all the time. So if I was a car company, I would want to be able to say, my 5-star rating is nobody can get into it. I can keep all the Russian hackers out of your car, and you can feel safe about that. So that's the new safety. It's keeping the hacker out of the car.
I have a slightly different opinion. I worked in a security firm in my past life, and there is no such thing as a perfectly secure system. It doesn't exist, right? So saying that exists is wrong to start with. I think I'll take on what I think Chris said earlier in the morning. Said a graceful exit is possible. In other words, it's possible for a system to it should be possible for the system to detect that it has been compromised. Probably that's the best that you can expect. I think there is no such, you can have improved levels of security, 64-bit encryption and quantum encryption and whatever, but there will always be the potential to be hacked. And I think the best thing that you can have is a system that actually is able to detect that it's been compromised and then at least not put other lives in danger.
We're working a lot in the automotive industry with our strategic partners that design some of these intrusion detection activities. and things, right down to the ECU level, right? So how has the ECU changed from its factory setting? You know, that sets an alert. There's a platform as a service that would provide even more security. And regarding the OBD port and what we need to do there, we know that we have legislation that says we have to
Gotta have it.
the
Actually
right
started
to
in
repair.
California.
So we have to work around all of those. So this is a dynamic problem space with lots of activity. I can assure you, I see it every day.
Thank you.
And by the way, it changes with time because the invasion protocols are continually improving.
Yep.
So it's not
Yep.
going to be static. We've got that one figured out. Next, you know, that's not going to happen.
Creative teenagers of the Eastern Bloc always be working. They got lots of Mountain Dew. With that, Mr. Heineman is over my shoulder.
Oh, okay. And now I'm on. I actually have a thought experiment to just on a slightly different note. The comment about one person's death due to some kind of a failure with an automobile not being acceptable, notwithstanding. Students, how many people die a year due to drunk driving? It was 35,000 or something like that?
Overall, traffic crash about 37,000. 1/3 of those deaths are from impaired driving.
Okay,
So
so
about 12,000.
about 12,000,
About
okay.
12,000.
All right, now change all of the cars in you know, the US, because that's a US figure, right to autonomous cars. And right now, state of the current art, how many people die? Is it more than 12,000?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
of the because of the errors in the autonomous system, it's going to be more than 12,000.
Depends on whose autonomous car you're talking about.
Very good point.
What system they're using.
Okay, so we probably don't have the answer to that question, but it is an interesting.
I mean, it was a joke, but I think there are some systems that are much safer than that already. But not every system is as safe.
Okay,
I
well,
think at this point
that's actually kind of an important thing to think about in terms of the optics that the public has
Right.
about autonomous systems, because that means that if one person's death is not acceptable, then we should all be riding autonomous cars now as they are. That's kind of what or better.
Well, actually, Jamie, I'm going to give you a different example. If we live truly in a zero-risk environment, we shouldn't be having motor vehicles on the road at all. If we're living truly in a notion that safety and life preserved is the number one priority, then we make lots of decisions in driving and even driving laws that actually they're a combination of safety and efficiency. And I think the point that we're at is that we always have to make that. I mean, unfortunately, we build the Brooklyn Bridge. God knows how many bridge workers died in that project. You know, that wasn't the goal, but the overall efficiency and safety goals for having the Brooklyn Bridge exist are incredibly important. The goal for all of us is, once again, you're absolutely right. We're dealing in a world where, you know, everybody's heard this stat, 94% of all crashes have an element of human error. Automated vehicle is the one technology that could truly address all forms of human error. We would probably all be better served to eliminate human error and have automation in a thoughtful, implementable way come into the fleet as quickly as possible. But you're right. How do you convince the person who believes that they are a great driver, machines fail, my iPhone freezes, I don't trust it? How do you sell a cost-benefit analysis argument about we will save way more people than less with automated driving, but most people aren't willing to accept that a machine will drive for them at this point, which is why we're talking about it. So your hypothetical is excellent. That's the issues that we're all sort of handling and trying to deal with.
Yeah, it gets down to a simple question. Do you want more people dead or less people dead?
Yep.
So which choice are you going to make?
The right choice is less, but living in an environment, you know, for folks that like to ride motorcycles, we have actually, from mandatory motorcycle helmet laws, which is one of the best things to keep you alive in case you do have a motorcycle crash. We've had, how many states? I think we've had like 15 or 20 states, and I think plus or minus, that have actually repealed their helmet laws. So we make decisions contrary to what is probably for what is an inherently risky activity, riding on a motor with two wheels against an environment of four-wheel vehicles. but a simple countermeasure that will help keep your head safe, people don't want to do it. And so we're constantly fighting against what is common sense and safety versus people willing to accept some risk for enjoyment, freedom. We've all, Ceto deals with it every day, about to say it interacted with people on the street. It's like, why are you hassling me by pulling me over? I'm pulling you over because you're not wearing your seatbelt and it isn't safe. So that's why I'm pulling you over, but people don't think about it that way.
Well, that's probably the scenario that we're looking at as far as moving ahead. People are going to resist these things because they want to do what they want to do. But simple fact is that you'll be safer even right now, which is a pretty powerful statement with these things that just got on the road like a few years ago, than we would be just, status quo. So on that note, I think I want to thank everybody. Well, one question since you.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Very important. So it's, and to take away from all of this today, I'd like to know where we actually are in terms of those key pillars that we talked about today, that being multi-party collaboration, safety parameterization, and the definition of the taxonomy and the nomenclature. Because there's been a lot of we have to talk, and for the sake of productivity, there's a lot of young people as well in the audience. They're very motivated and willing to contribute. So where do we stand actually right now? And so that way, we're not doing unnecessary work. We can start to build on top of the shoulders of giants.
Okay, well, I'll start. So there is activity this week in DC that I think Mircea had mentioned is being done where they're actually working on taxonomy. So taxonomy does matter. Regarding collaboration, the good news is it is working. I'm doing it every day with 47 different companies representing about 600 different people. And if you extend that to the strategic partners, it's 1,500 people. So we are working collaboratively now. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. And the last item, I can't remember.
Oh, no, sure. And I guess what was the third item, sir? I apologize. Taxonomy was covered, collaboration was covered. I'll sit on that.
And then parameterization, for example, what actually defines a safe distance in a single lane? It would be very case specific, but you need certain parameters in place to define what actually safety means. So like distance, for example, that's a simple one.
Well, some of that's probably going to interact between, believe it or not, a lot of the statutes on the road are actually based upon the experiences of driving and interactions, such as following distance and stopping, fulls, rolling stops, things of that nature. So a lot of those things, I think, are captured within probably the vehicle code that was going to be transferred over to the automated vehicle. But, there's going to be a lot of elements that are be a part of that. And I know that as part of sort of the legal review, and I know the law enforcement is working through this, and frankly, human behavioral studies are working through this, like, why do people keep rear-ending Waymo taxis? Try to solve those questions. I think it's going to be a part of which people are working through. And also on collaboration, my old agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is working hard to be a general convener of all of these people that are in the ecosystem. I know that AMVA is an important part of that group. There's a lot of others of getting everybody in the room to talk. So it is a process, but believe me, it is ongoing. And I'm sure all of us will be happy to to talk to you offline and continue on as well.
Right. I just want to say as the host, this is just the first of what we see is something that should be done annually. And every year we'll get better at it. And every year we'll get better at what we're doing. We're going to make records and reports of what people talked about today. And if you want to help us with that, that would be great. Since you were here at the summit, we would love to have help and your input on it, on what you saw was important here today. But we're not going to do just one get-together. This is the beginning of what we see as a long-term project, and it's going to get, it'll get more clear and more defined. That is certainly the hope. What I see is a number of threads that were talked about today, that each of them can be developed on, and each of them have great opportunity to make us more safe and to provide us direction on how to make a safer future. So I feel very optimistic, and thank you so much for coming today. Are we wrapping up? Is there-
Yes, I want to thank all our panelists for their valuable time, and thanks everybody for coming, and thank you in particular, Velodyne, for starting the ball rolling. Thank you.
I